By the end of the 1800s, the American West was filled with settlers from all across the eastern states and Europe. They built permanent roads and large cities, displacing hundreds of Native American tribes in the process. But decades before these settlers came the mountain men. The mountain men of the American West sought the pelts of the once plentiful beaver. The pelts were used to make clothing, especially top hats, which were very popular in eastern cities and in Europe. The mountain men were also known to be extremely adventurous and independent. They went west into mostly uncharted territory, with some of them living most of their lives in the mountains. They interacted extensively with the Native Americans wherever they went. They traded with them, fought against them, and at times they would even live with and marry into certain tribes. To me, the Mountain Men era is one of the most fascinating times in the history of the United States. Today's story follows a group of mountain men as they cross the Great Basin of modern-day Nevada. This story comes from the autobiography My 60 Years on the Plains by W.T. Hamilton, also known as Wildcat Bill, published in 1905. In July of 1844, Wildcat Bill and a party of 39 fur trappers arrived in Honey Lake Valley on the California-Nevada border. They were coming down out of southern Oregon after having some trouble with the Modoc tribe. They spent 3 months in the valley, which at the time did not have a name. The mountain men spent their time hunting, fishing, exploring, and practicing with their weapons. During this time, many Indians of an unnamed tribe came to trade furs. Bill describes them as being poor and mentions that it was difficult to communicate with them through signs. This is likely because the men were so far west, the natives in the area had a different form of sign language than the plain sign language that most mountain men were familiar with. Bill claims that towards the end of their stay, some of the natives were caught stealing and chased out of the camp with whips. The natives then stopped visiting the men. Early one morning, shots were fired by the camp guards. The men rushed up and saw a native man running through camp. They shot him dead. 4 others had been killed by the guards. They had apparently been trying to steal. Some of the men wanted to attack the village, but they decided against it. Instead, to set an example, the mountain men burned the bodies of the 5 dead natives. The men held a council to decide whether to head south to Southern California or southeast into Nevada. They decided on Nevada in hopes of better hunting and trapping. In October, the men set out south along the base of the mountains. They trapped all the streams leading out of the mountains until they reached Pyramid Lake. Here they met a village of what Bill describes as Paiutes, who spoke Shoshone. Now there were both northern and southern Paiutes living in Nevada, but they did not speak Shoshone. There were also various western Shoshone bands living in Nevada. Shoshone and the Paiute languages both belong to the Uto-Aztecan language family, meaning some dialects are similar enough for its speakers to communicate across different tribes or bands. So either Bill and his men had met Paiutes speaking one of the numerous Paiute dialects and mistook it as Shoshone, or they had met some Shoshone and mistook them as Paiutes. Due to where Pyramid Lake is, it is likely they were Paiutes. Bill claims these Paiutes thought they were a new tribe of white men because they used pads on their horses and were tan like Indians. They traded with them for a short time, then continued on. Their next stop was the Truckee River. During the journey, Bill saw more black-tailed deer than he had ever seen before. At the upper end of the river, they camped at a lake the Indians called Upper Lake. A small band of unnamed natives had their camp nearby, and the men visited them for a short time. Bill describes them as being very poor but expert fishermen. As the men started out again, it began to snow, and soon the trail was nearly invisible. The men continued on, anxious to not lose any of their near 250 horses. They rode 10 men in front, with the rest of the men single file on either side of the herd. In this miserable condition, the men kept on for most of the day, until they reached a plateau. But realizing they could not camp there, they kept going. They descended the plateau and 30 minutes later were at the bottom. It was now dark and they could not get a good idea of the land around them. But they could hear water and see some nearby trees. Still snowing, the men hurriedly tied their horses to the trees and set up their tents. In a quote from Wildcat Bill, "I have been in many a dismal place, but none more so than this." The men camped here for 4 days, then continued along the base of the mountains. Eventually, they came to a place on the Carson River, stopping because of the plentiful beaver and Indian sign in the area. Just after setting up their tents, a dozen mounted Indians rode into camp. They were Paiutes, and they told the men their village was not far away, and seemed pleased when the men told them they intended to stay in the area during the winter. They gave the Paiutes some beaver meat and invited them to stay for dinner. Bill claimed that some of them knew a little Spanish. The Indians left with the promise to be back. The next day, most of the men set out to check their traps. Later in the day, while they were skinning their beaver they had caught, the Paiutes returned in large numbers. The trappers told the Indian women they could have the meat from the beavers, to which they were extremely pleased. For the next 6 weeks, the men trapped and hunted. They had very friendly relations with the natives and frequently visited. On the 25th of February, 1845, the men struck out again. The whole Paiute village gathered to see them off and invited them to come back in the future. The men followed Indian trails 50 miles across the desert until they reached Humboldt Lake. From there, they trapped up a river until they were approached by a war party of 50 mounted Indians who wanted to know what the men were doing in their country. The trappers attempted to make peace, but the Indians, who Bill identified as a branch of the Paiutes, demanded horses. They were refused and left extremely angry. Although aware of the danger, the beaver sign in the area was too good to pass up. They made camp nearby, making sure to stay vigilant. The next day, the men began trapping, and all of them returned except a man named Crawford. Because he was not back at the expected time, 10 trappers set out to find him, led by a man named Dockett, who had seen Crawford setting traps at a bend in the river. Scouting ahead, wary of ambush, the men found Crawford's traps along with Indian tracks. Their fears were confirmed as they saw the blood. Reading the tracks, Crawford had been ambushed by 6 to 8 Indians. They had killed him and then thrown him in the river, which was 4 feet deep. They soon found their friend. Crawford had been scalped, his eyes were gouged out, and his face had been slashed, and he was, quote, otherwise mutilated in a way too horrible to describe. The Indians had also taken his horse, his rifle, and 2 pistols. The men returned to camp with the body of their friend, and had a makeshift funeral, burying him in the ground with no marker. At 2 p.m. that afternoon, the trappers' guard signaled Indians coming on horseback. The men hurriedly corralled their horses and prepared to fight. The guards reported 60 mounted Indians, and they soon made their appearance on a ridge about 300 yards away. The Indians fired a shot that came so close that the men knew that it was their slain friend's rifle. The Indians challenged the men to come out and fight. Eager to avenge Crawford's death, the men left 3 guards for the camp and rode out to meet their enemy. When the Paiutes saw the mountain men approaching, they let out their war whoops and charged down the hill. Splitting into 2 groups, they attacked on both sides. The trappers waited until the Indians were within 100 yards before stopping and letting out a deadly volley with their rifles, killing around 25 of them. With the Indians stunned, the trappers charged with pistols in hand. The fight lasted only minutes, and Wildcat Bill claims few Indians escaped alive. The men looted the bodies and Crawford's guns were recovered. The trappers had lost 2 horses and no men, with a few of them suffering minor arrow wounds. It's Bill's opinion that these Paiutes had never before fought such a well-armed group, and were unprepared. With their friend avenged, the mountain men packed up camp and continued on their journey.